Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to Inside Whitehall with me, Jonathan Gullis.
And me, James Starkey.
Well, James, there was a famous tweet after the last general election that said, or is it, the quiet, it's nice, isn't it? Andrew Marr
So,
on
Mark,
LBC giving us a spiel about how finally calm and order was going to be restored to British politics.
we
No
had,
more, no more drama.
yeah, we had Otto English. I think very close after the election. It's nice, isn't it? The quiet. And then there's been various variations on the theme. I think there was someone from Channel 4 that tweeted something similar. And then I think the Marr quote was helpfully sent by a co-conspirator of ours, should we call them?
Yeah.
For the first time in our lives, Britain actually looks like a little piece of have a little haven of peace and stability.
Well, James, we say all this and we laugh about this, despite the fact it also brings us great despair because Westminster, the drama doesn't seem to ever end. We have Tulip Sadiq, the former anti-corruption minister, has now been sentenced to an additional 4 years for corruption in Bangladesh, following her aunt being deposed as leader and being sentenced, I think, to death for corruption charges. We have Dan Norris, who was already suspended from the House of Commons for allegedly having sexually assaulted a woman, which he was charged by the police. He's now since had a further charge of rape, sexual assault, and upskirting, and hasn't been in the House, I think, since early 2025, the first quarter of 2025. He actually represents and beat Jacob Rees-Mogg seat in North East Somerset. And then the scandal that seems to everyone had thought blown over last September, but blown up by further revelations in the Epstein files released by the Department for Justice over in the United States of America, that Peter Mandelson has been found to have forwarded what appears to be market sensitive information ahead of publication to his friend at the time, convicted paedophile Jeffrey Epstein. That has led to a report going into the police, of which the Cabinet Office and Sir Keir Starmer's team have cooperated and handed over evidence.
Well,
It turns out
I
that we
would stop
also
you
had.
there. I would
Oh,
stop you
go
there.
on, James.
So I think there's some fascinating things around the story. I had lunch with someone from the lobby just after they came from lobby. And for listeners or viewers who don't know, and I think we did cover a bit of this in series 1 or 2 when we kind of looked at how the lobby works, which is you have an on the record lobby, and then afterwards what they call a dark lobby, which I think we did cover with Kate McCann and Harry Cole a while ago. And dark lobby is kind of less on the record, so it's reportable. And I think that is where some of the information about the Cabinet Office passing on a file, kind of confirming some of the stuff that's now in the public domain to the Metropolitan Police. The really interesting things to me are, so I tweeted about this today. I think there's gonna, and I was talking to this friend over lunch about it. I think there's gonna have to be an investigation. Is that because some people listening and viewing may be aware that Gordon Brown made public either Sunday or Monday, yesterday or maybe Sunday, made public that back in September, so not that long ago, 5, 6 months ago, he had contacted the Cabinet Office after seeing some of the Mandelson revelations, asking them to go back and look at emails. Now, from what we know in the public domain, and so this is to some degree speculation, but based on reporting that I think has come out of government through the media, from what we know, the Cabinet Office said, well, we can't find any emails. And um, also, I think important, I don't know how far we'll get into this, but just some important points of fact. So, what's changed between then and now? How hard did they look is the question I would ask for. And if I was the opposition, if I was Kemi Badenoch and her team, I think tonight, as we speak on Tuesday evening, they're pushing for at least a vetting file. So when Mandelson was made ambassador, he would have gone through a vetting process, a procedure, as ministers do as well. and they're in that you typically have to answer questions and come forward with anything that might be a conflict of interest. Yeah, it can be shares in a company or all that kind of stuff. Because he was going to America, I guess they would have asked if there's anything relevant there. So the Conservatives now want to see that famously, and I think this is a point of fact. Starmer actually announced Mandelson's appointment at the time before vetting had been completed. We were told kind of vetting. I think Darren Jones then was on the media this week saying, "Well, what can you do if someone lies in their vetting?" And he therefore seemed to be, to me, heavily implying that Peter Mandelson hadn't been wholly untruthful. But I think be careful what we say because it's all very quick, all kind of moving, very quick story. But the interesting thing to me is I think there'll be questions about what what efforts, what lengths did the Cabinet Office go to? Because while it's the case you shouldn't show favouritism, I think it is the case that when a former Prime Minister, Gordon Brown is a respected politician by all parties. I think whichever allegiance you have, most people would see Gordon Brown in particular as quite a straight shooter. If a former prime minister says, "Hey, Cabinet Office, I would like you to have a look at this and see what's going on," that should be taken pretty seriously. And so I think there's going to be some immediate questions in the coming days as to what happened there. There's going to be the questions the Conservatives have raised today, which is, well, let's see his vetting file. They've said before it breaks process, we don't want to make a habit of doing this, but I think there's still going to be a lot of pressure on that about who knew what when. And I'll finish this mini monologue on this. The point that the person from the lobby made to me. So they said it was an interesting contrast with yesterday when it was quite unclear. Labour basically said, so what you'll have is you have the Prime Minister's official spokesman. And so some of the quotes that you see daily, a spokesman for the Prime Minister, that is one person in there, or they have a deputy often. And Prime Minister's official spokesman. Yesterday, they said, well, it would be too complex to strip Peter Mandelson of a peer. It would require an act of Parliament. And that's something I'd like to go into about whether or not you think that's a good thing, because I think it also relates to petitions to remove sitting MPs as well. I think there's kind of crossover in terms of the ethics. But they said, but that today is completely changed. So I think they'd hot-footed it straight from the number 10 briefing room over to lunch with me. That's changed in that I think that's moved on, and they do seem now willing to at least consider that piece of legislation that they would require to remove Peter Mandelson. But now the file's been moved on to the Metropolitan Police. I suspect for government, what we'll hear tomorrow is when there's calls for an investigation into Mandelson's behaviour in government, vetting files, and all this kind of stuff. I suspect the line now will be, it's a police matter. We need to let the police handle this, and that they'll be hoping to give them some cover, and we'll see. I mean, I have a lot of sympathy with the police on this, because the one last thing I'll mention is what it transpires today is it appears one of the reasons why the cabinet would have struggled is Peter Mandelson was using a private email address as a minister at the time, so therefore the cabinet office don't have access to that, and I think it's being reported that email is now defunct anyway. So it's going to be interesting to see what they actually can investigate other than what's already there in the Epstein files, because we wouldn't know any of this without the Epstein files because they weren't on government emails.
Yeah, exactly. And we can say that the Met Police tonight have confirmed, that's tonight as of Tuesday, the 3rd of February, as we're recording, that Peter Mandelson is now under criminal investigation for leaking government information. Jeffrey Epstein, the statement says, we can confirm the Metropolitan Police has now launched an investigation into a 72-year-old man, a former government minister, for misconduct in public office offences. The Met will continue to assess all relevant information brought to our attention as part of this investigation and won't be commenting any further at this time. This is massive because no one in the political world has ever actually been formally charged and then sentenced or found guilty under such an offence. The offence, by the way, that carries life imprisonment as a penalty, and it is being reported that the Met Police have now or going to be contacting the Department of Justice in the United States of America to request unredacted copies of any and all relevant information from the Epstein files. Because as James has rightly said, it is now reported that the problem we have here is that the emails that have been brought in the public sphere contain an email address that was Lord Mandelson's then personal private email, and that actually he was doing his job, it seems, as the then business secretary under Gordon Brown, using his personal email to communicate with the then Prime Minister directly at the time, which is just something utterly shocking, which also meant he was also forwarding on these emails. One of the emails, very damning, is the £500 billion euro bailout that took place that Mandelson had a 12-hour head start on before it was publicly confirmed that was going ahead. And obviously, there is no understanding about whether or not Jeffrey Epstein personally profited off that, but it is market-sensitive information, and there are serious questions being raised based on information in the emails that suggests that Lord Mandelson's now husband received allegedly personal payments directly from Jeffrey Epstein, and so there will be now huge questions. This is a massive scandal, and I think, James, what you've hit the nail on the head here. For us, let's get into what this means politically for Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour Party, and just the UK political sphere overall. You are correct. It is reported the Conservative Party is looking at using their opposition day, which there is scheduled and was scheduled well in advance for the 4th of February, so tomorrow, to lay a motion that would be legally binding. Very rare does that happen, but wording can be found to basically say we are seeking to force the government, and it's a tactic Sir Keir Starmer himself used against then Boris Johnson when it came to the COVID investigation for behaviour in and around 10 Downing Street. And a lot of allegedly Labour MPs are willing to vote with the Conservative Party motion because obviously they fear politically this it could be perceived that if they did not, they would be willing to potentially looking like they're covering up for Peter Mandelson, which obviously would be toxic. So James, first of all, politically here for Labour, they have an opportunity if they do see, and the order paper's not yet published, but if they see that that motion's been laid on the order paper, is it better to get ahead? If you were in number 10, would you be advising them just announce in the morning that you are going to release the information rather than be forced into it?
The tough one on the vetting. It's hard to answer that question without full information. The thing that I think was clear, I think me and you kind of had an exchange on this on text yesterday morning. I think so. A couple of things I'll say. One, going back to the lunch with my friend from the lobby, they'd been on the China trip last week, right? Which already feels like ages ago, and we're saying how delighted the government were with this China trip, and they contrasted it with the Chinese who they were kind of happy to have it. But the way it was put to me is, the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and his team were so happy if they write a book, it could form a chapter. If you ask the Chinese Premier Xi in 2 weeks who was over here, probably wouldn't remember. That was the kind of contrast in terms of how amazing the kind of Brits felt it was last week. So they've come off the back of that. They were saying this to say just how quickly this story is moving. So, and with stories like this, my caveat would be me and you have been in Westminster long enough. These things can fizzle out. By mid next week, it could fizzle out. If the police go in for a long investigation, for example, then this will kind of bubble up in the news for a few days. And after a week, people will get bored of it and they won't really, no one can say anything. No government ministers can comment on it. The Tories can push for some stuff. Farage can push for some stuff. Reform can push for some stuff. But fundamentally, the government will fairly genuinely be able to say, well, look, this is a live police investigation. We can't go around publishing things that are prejudicial to that. We've got to work with the police, which is probably as it should be with a police investigation, to be fair. So there's that. But they were saying, over the weekend, this looked very embarrassing and perhaps the end of Peter Mandelson. Most people probably have seen this picture with him in his underpants, and it's a kind of water cooler talker. It's one of those things today that people who don't really follow politics were mentioning to me. Move very quickly from that into something I say more serious. So I'm just talking about a kind of picture of Peter Mandelson rather than the Epstein allegations. Something far more serious for Peter Mandelson, which is, it's moved from embarrassing emails, this embarrassing friendship he had with Jeffrey Epstein, through to, I would say, the problem with this is it's different in many ways, but there's some similarities. MP's expenses or Partygate is I think it's now very, very hard to predict where this goes. So, f- you know, things. Most people will probably be too young to remember, but there was a kind of famous press conference from a guy called Donald Rumsfeld in the George Bush administration. And I think it was when they were going into Iraq. Now, and he kind of kicked it off by saying, well, there are known knowns. That is, there are things that we know we know. There are known unknowns. There are things we don't know. And there are, as he famously said, unknown unknowns, things we don't know. And I always think about that when you have scandals like this. There are things we know. We know that Mandelson is going to be looked at for, as you said, kind of a breach of propriety in public office. There may be issues around the Bribery Act the police want to look at, etc. A straight criminal investigation on some things that are in the public domain that people who understand legalities better than you or I will be able to talk about. There are perhaps known unknowns. So, are they going to find other emails related to this kind of thing, his relationship with Epstein, payments, all this kind of business? Fine. But I think if I was in government, I'd be really worried about the unknown unknowns. So now you've got the police talking to the US Justice Department for unredacted emails. What is there that we have no idea of? Who else, frankly, who else does it implicate? And what what about the last kind of 18 months of Peter Mandelson's process of becoming ambassador? There's going to be a squabble, I would suggest. You saw some briefing when Peter Mandelson left around Keir Starmer's top team around who was to blame for that, who pushed for him to be in. Um, today people were circulating pictures of Peter Mandelson and Wes Streeting and trying to implicate Wes Streeting. Now, Peter Mandelson was a very, very prominent Labour politician. Not massively surprising he'd been campaigning with Wes Streeting. I don't think it means much prima facie, but that's the kind of thing we've seen before with these things. When you peel the lid off, the truth is, whether you're a journalist, whether you're sat in number 10, whether you're an opposition politician, I suspect no one is quite sure where this goes. And the other thing I'll say is, when the journalist said, "What do you think?" I said, "Well, this police investigation could go on for weeks, months. And if it does, in the usual Westminster way, people lose attention. And by the time let's say in 3 months, they decide there's no charges, there'll be a push, but it will drop out. The kind of shock of it will have dropped out the public conscience. We'll be past the local elections. There'll be other stuff going on. If the police come back within a week or two and say, look, I know it doesn't look good, but we just don't have the evidence here. We've got 16, 17-year-old emails. We can't access the server because the email account doesn't work anymore. We can't speak to Jeffrey Epstein to know if he acted on this information. There's no evidence he did or that any money changed hands. Yes, it looks really bad, but we can't prove a crime. That's possible, right? If that happens in the next couple of weeks, then it will be straight back over to the government. Because what people will say is, okay, well, the police can't do anything. What are you going to do about it? And they're going to want an inquiry back into the things we were just talking about. Why did the Cabinet Office not find anything in September? Right? So the question will be, who looked at it? Who was told about that? And what did they do about it? How quickly did they go back to the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown and say, we can't find anything? What effort was made? That's going to be a big, big question. There'll be a question about what can the government look at from the time through the government's records. So I don't know.
It's reporting suggesting it's pretty dicey at the moment by the sounds of things. I mean, what's I think shocking with the Gordon Brown thing, James, is that we know that the timeline is Gordon Brown reported the complaint. I believe it's around the 10th of September. And then following day, Sir Keir Starmer's at PMQ saying he retains full confidence in Peter Mandelson. So what is even worse is a former Labour leader and Prime Minister who's made a official kind of raise a red flag with the Cabinet Office, which is adjoined to 10 Downing Street. And you assume, therefore, Gordon Brown will have the phone numbers of Keir Starmer directly as well as his top team. Somehow that information potentially hasn't been relayed to the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, in order to prevent him or give him a better line than "I retain full confidence," which at the time was really embarrassing. So I think it was literally a matter of a couple of days after that statement that Lord Mandelson actually had to resign as the ambassador to the United States of America. And look, for me politically, I look at the situation and think you're right. There's a lot of focus, rightly, on what did Lord Mandelson do, and the serious potential criminality how the emails are looking, at the moment. However, that is going to give some cover for the fact there are going to be serious questions raised about Peter Mandelson was literally nicknamed the Prince of Darkness. Not normally a name that you would associate with someone who you tend to think is a good person, right? Not a name that not many people in politics normally would court. Then you've got the fact that Peter Mandelson has twice previously resigned from government under, I think, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown for, for failing to uphold the standards, I suspect it were, or failing to be
I mean,
totally squeaky clean.
what
And then
the
you've
problem
got
is
James,
here?
sorry, very quick. And then you've got very quickly, James, you've also then got on top of the fact that at the time that Lord Mandelson was selected by Keir Starmer to be the ambassador to the United States of America, we know it was already reported publicly that Peter Mandelson had, despite claiming his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein had ended, actually was then staying in a property owned by Jeffrey Epstein whilst Jeffrey Epstein was in prison and serving a sentence for soliciting a minor in sexual intercourse. I mean, there's going to be huge questions now about the judgment of Sir Keir Starmer in thinking the risk versus the reward. And by the way, a phrase that I think a certain Boris Johnson used about Chris Pincher, that was or certainly a spokesperson on behalf of Boris Johnson, said that Boris Johnson had to weigh up Chris Pincher's talents with the rumours, which obviously I think was a huge reason why I felt I had to resign as a PPS on the same day that Rishi Sunak and Sajid Javid resigned in that government. So, and then Morgan McSweeney, the chief of staff, who's not courted the limelight, but certainly regularly hauled into the limelight, and particularly the soft left of the Parliamentary Labour Party have huge disdain for, because they blame him a lot for the current strategy of what they would deem as parroting the reform lines on things like immigration, and Morgan McSweeney having taken control of the National Executive Committee, having made sure that it was he and Keir Starmer selecting parliamentary candidates rather than letting local members
Not
have the
Andy
choice that
Burnham.
they want, and things like blocking Andy Burnham. So now, Morgan McSweeney, there's been many people who wanted his head on the chopping block. There's a lot of people who say Morgan McSweeney and Peter Mandelson were very close, having lots of regular communication, and prior when Keir Starmer was in opposition, and since before Keir Starmer's resignation. And so the question is, can Morgan McSweeney survive? There has this old adage, is there not, that an advisor, James, is regularly in the news, tends to normally lead to the end of said advisor. And the running joke at the moment in Westminster is Keir Starmer has announced today he has, quote, full confidence in Morgan
Yes.
McSweeney, and that klaxon normally means it's the beginning of the end.
Well, we all know when a football manager gets it, it means that they're going to be off in a week. So see if the same applies to politics. I mean, I think there's clearly people that want to get rid of Morgan, and they're going to use this rightly or wrongly. I don't, it's hard to know where blame lies. It doesn't. It certainly seems like it wouldn't solely lie with him. I think the interesting thing is, like, we talked about this in the last couple of weeks. The To me, you mentioned the Chris Pinter episode. To me, you need a moment of crystallization for something drastic to happen, like the downfall of a prime minister, right? And we saw that it was the Pinter episode with Boris, famously. We were both around that, and I think today, texting a few Labour people, one of them said to me, "I don't. I think he'll struggle to survive losing the Gorton by-election, which I'm sure we'll come onto. You've been up there yourself today, the Gorton by-election, and the not and the local and devolved elections, Wales and Scotland. Now, to me, I think, how much are they priced in? You've got the Burnham backdrop to the Gorton one. People will say, well, if you'd have had Burnham, you could have won it. If they do lose it to Reform or the Greens, let's see where that goes. And with with the devolved elections in Wales and Scotland, there's at least some groundwork been laid. They're going to do poorly. I do wonder if you then have a killer moment around Mandelson, not long after the locals or around the same time. Is that the kind of thing that could end up bringing him down? Because I say that because, tell me what you think. I say that because around that Boris area, where me and you both experienced directly, was in government for some of it, you were an MP for all of it. There, I would, the Pincher episode wasn't necessarily the thing. If you'd have seen it on paper a year before, you'd have assumed would have brought him down. I don't think it was because it came at the end of a long line of other issues. It was a I don't want to trivialize it because of the allegations against Chris, but uh, I think you wouldn't have predicted it. It was a kind of straw that broke the camel's back. The allegations on Chris were very serious, but it was really about this kind of media handling and the way Boris handled it, rather than the allegations, that brought an end to Boris. It was. I think you were closer to it, me, but seemed to trivialize it. Seemed to lack of take responsibility and blame other people, and so I think one bit of speculation that my lunch partner had was, well, the one or two cards Starmer has left to play is to get rid of Morgan, and at some point, for different reasons not related to this, Rachel Reeves. I think the other thing is, when people start getting rid of people close to them, Liz Truss and Quasi, maybe she was doomed anyway, but they're your last line of defense. So getting rid of Morgan might be a card that Starmer can play. Maybe he's willing to play it, maybe he's not. He's obviously stuck by him so far. But when he does, I think there'll be a lot of people that feel the clock are ticking. The clock's ticking on his time at that point. I think that's the problem he'll have, because I think you're then in the last chance saloon, because you don't really have much to play after that.
Well, I think you're bang on the money there. I mean, there was those rumours that actually in September or around the reshuffle last year, Morgan McSweeney was potentially being discussed in private meetings that he was not invited to by with Sir Keir Starmer and other advisors. That Morgan was going to be shown the door. Morgan appears to have got word of it, and Keir Starmer kind of shuffle the decks a bit, and Morgan were given some other rules. But it does certainly sound like two people who were joined at the hip are no longer joined at the hip anymore. There's a lot of reporting that since the introduction of Tim Allen, for example, Keir Starmer's no longer listening in the same way to Morgan McSweeney as he once was. In fact, there's a lot of speculation that Tim Allen and Morgan McSweeney don't see eye to eye. Tim Allen has, I think it's fair to say, a different perspective of the type of messaging and campaign that Labour should be focused on to what Morgan is. But so putting all that sort of the internal melodrama that clearly is existing in 10 Downing Street with key figures at the moment. And by the way, Lord Matthew Dawe, the newly anointed peer, is now even dragged into this scandal as well. And he was obviously a former advisor as well to Sir Keir Starmer around the time of obviously Peter Mandelson's appointment as ambassador. But I agree with you. If Sir Keir Starmer gets to the place where he thinks feeding Morgan to the Lions, aka the Labour Parliamentary Party, is somehow going to buy him some time, he is correct. It will buy him some time. It does not buy him indefinite survival. Oh no, it doesn't mean he's pardoned from ever being challenged going forward, and that will only last for as long as the next scandal. So if Sir Keir Starmer were to we wake up tomorrow and say Morgan McSweeney has been sacked, the next deadline is the 26th of February when the Gorton and Denton by-election takes place. And when Morgan isn't there, and Morgan will argue, I'm sure from the outside, I would have run a very different strategy. I wasn't allowed to be in control of the campaign. Other people around the Prime Minister were advising him on the messaging and what to say, blah, blah, blah. That will just mean that that's one less person that Sir Keir Starmer has as a human shield. And you're right. I think there are two people, the Chief of Staff, if you've been there a long time, and the Chancellor. If one of those two goes, or even if two of those two go, I think then it is. If those two went, I would then be shocked if Sir Keir Starmer saw as the next election as leader of the Labour Party. If one of those goes, I think it dramatically increases his chances of beating our own prediction and suggesting that Keir Starmer may well actually no longer be in place by the end of 2026. It's going to be utterly fascinating. And, if this opposition day motion happens and Sir Keir Starmer hasn't already agreed to release the information, it'll be interesting to see the Conservative Party being able to work with the legal clerks of the House of Commons who help with such motions to find a way of ensuring that the Prime Minister is legally forced to have to disclose that information. And if that is the case, how many of those Labour MPs are going to defy a whip? Because we have seen Labour MPs lose the whip as a member of the Labour Parliamentary Party for voting with the Carl Turner, for example, voted with the Conservatives' opposition day motion on stopping the ending of jury trials. I think there was a Labour MP who voted with the Conservatives on a motion regarding the family farm tax. And just so listeners know, these opposition day motions are given to the two largest opposition parties. The Conservatives, as the official opposition, get much more than at this moment in time the Liberal Democrats get some. They are normally motions where basically the opposition tries to embarrass the government, or they push an issue of the day. But we've seen in recent times, since 2019, there are legal mechanisms that can be played and certain wording that can be used to force a government to at least, I think, reveal information. They can't necessarily change the law, so it's going to be interesting there. And if those Labour MPs rebel, what numbers do they rebel in? And therefore, will Sir Keir Starmer have to release the information, agree, but will he do that in enough time to make it look like his hand wasn't forced? Because that only means he spent more political capital and will put the more pressure on to feed that Labour Parliamentary Party someone in. And I suspect Morgan is at the moment front and centre for the punishment. There's been some pretty brutal briefings given to journalists by Labour MPs on their opinion of Morgan McSweeney, which in itself is ironic, bearing in mind Morgan McSweeney, whatever people think, did run a successful electoral strategy that meant that those people have their jobs, and many of those people, for the first time in their lives, have achieved their dream.
But of course, politics is a brutal game. So I think when people think they're going to lose those jobs, then it's like, thanks for the memories, but this isn't really working out. I mean, you know that better than anyone. One thing I want to touch on, slightly separate, just because we haven't spoken about this. I just got into it with someone over lunch, and kind of was thinking, I know what I think about it politically, but kind of ethically maybe different. So, um, there's been some discussion about whether or not it's a good idea to remove Peter Mandelson's peerage. Now,
Yeah,
I think someone kind of listening, watching this might think, "Oh, that's crazy." Look at what we've seen. What's in the public domain. I don't need a police investigation. There's a lot of pressure. Opposition parties are calling for it. It appears that in the last 24 hours, the Labour Party is moving that way. I don't know if the police investigation will cause a delay in that, but uh, I kind of politically, if I was the opposite, if I was Reform or Conservative team, I would say, yeah, the kind of details the government need to work out that, right? This guy needs to go. And I think if I was a peer or a Labour member, I would probably be like, well, yeah, this guy's causing is an embarrassment. He's damaging the reputation of the House of Lords and Parliament as a whole and the Labour Party. So they are clear reasons. Often people have just in straight employment contracts. If you are, I can't remember the term, but it would basically be like if you're damaging the reputation of the business or whatever, that would be a reason for dismissal. On the other hand, so this is my kind of straw man argument. I'm curious what you think. As a precedent, at the moment, as things stand, we will all have a judgment, and we've just discussed some of our own and other people's. But Peter Mandelson hasn't been found specifically guilty by a parliamentary investigation. There's a standards commissioner that exists for the Lords as it does for the Commons. Hasn't been found guilty about doing anything wrong there. Hasn't been charged by the police. Never mind found guilty. We're in a country that even when you're charged, it's not confirmation of guilt. That's why we used to have jury trials until of Labour, but it's why we have trials. and so what then to stop if this becomes commonplace? Where's the barrier for, I don't like what he said, let's remove what happens if Keir Starmer removes Peter Mandelson and then just thinks, I don't really like what some of the Tories say, they bring Parliament into disrepute, I'm just going to remove 5 of them. Or someone someone goes to Reform and they say, well, if a peer switches to Reform and they say, well, they shouldn't be allowed to do that. I'm going to remove them. I'm not saying Keir Starmer, it doesn't necessarily strike me as the kind of person that would do, but it would create a precedent. And yeah, so I kind of thought there is, I think I'm probably for it, but it made me uncomfortable because it's not that straightforward and simple to say it's, or am I being too wet, or, looking at it, am I overcomplicating something that's much simpler?
So I think it's clear that there needs to be some sort of reform to the system. I mean, let's be clear. First of all, Peter Mandelson said he was on a sort of indefinite leave from the House of
I think
Lords.
he said
He's
had
now
no
since
plans to return, or a
no
specific
plans to return.
wording,
Yes,
which
he's now
means he
said
can return. He just doesn't have any plans.
yes, absolutely. He's now said tonight, it's been published that he has officially resigned from the House of Lords. So therefore,
Okay,
he can no longer, he will no longer have the parliamentary pass, nor will he be able to sit in the chamber,
but he's still a
influence
peer. He's still
legislation.
Lord
But
Mandelson.
I was about to say this. So whilst he can no longer go and earn his money, about 350, 360 quid a day, or vote, or draft legislation, or even walk around the parliamentary estate, he will still retain the title as Lord Mandelson. His peerage remains. Now, I think that number one, if you resign from the House of Lords, I think the rule should be that, I think there's fair discussion of do you then lose the title? Because essentially you are appointed for life, and the idea is that you're obviously going to give your expertise. If you're resigning from it, whether that through scandal, through ill health, or anything like that, do you really need to retain the title? Now, people can get into a debate on that. I think that there clearly needs to be some sort of mechanism where if we have gone through due process, and I heard Alex Burkhardt on Times Radio this morning, and I think he had the right idea on this, which is there is currently going to be an investigation. Let's see if Peter Manderson's even charged. If he is then charged, then he needs to go before, well, we assume a jury of his peers, but who knows with this Labour government, or a judge, which ironically a Labour policy might undo Peter Mandelson. I think in the case where a peer has been found criminally guilty of any offence of a year or more, the same rule that currently applies to a member of the House of Commons, where in the House of Commons that would automatically trigger a recall petition. I think that that should automatically trigger you losing not just access to the House, but also losing your peerage. So there's some sort of equalisation in both the Commons and the Lords in terms of outcome and punishment. Because obviously the idea of the Commons having the recall petition is then back to voters, it's democracy, whereas in the peers don't have that. So I think if you are sentenced to a year or more, you've been found guilty, you should instantly, not just you're kicked out of the House of Lords, your peerage automatically goes as well. I think that would then be a nice simple mechanism, but also allows due process to take place. Because as you know, James, the Standards Committee are going to say, whilst there is a criminal investigation, we are not allowed to
Mm.
investigate this as a standards thing. We can only do that once a criminal
And
investigation
we had this
has
before in
concluded.
Parliament when an MP gets placed into investigation, the whole standard stuff pauses. We have to wait around, understandably, but it does mean that kind of thing has slowed down.
And like you say, it can take longer. So I think that would be a bar. But I'm with you. I don't. What I would fear if we just gave the Prime Minister of the day the ability to remove a peer, their peerage, not just as in kick out the House of Lords, but also their title, is how do we know that any leader doesn't end up just one day saying, well, I've got a grudge with X or Y or so and so is being difficult. I mean, you may even see people from their own political parties being kicked out if they're laying amendments that are difficult, and that would be a terrible thing to do. So there has to be the House of Lords has an important role as a revision chamber. I know it's also a place you can introduce legislation. I've long believed that the House of Lords shouldn't contain any religious figures. It shouldn't retain any politicians. I think that one of the great things about the UK that we have is this peerage, and that we should go around the world and be willing to offer peerages to anyone, regardless of their whether they're a British citizen or not, and say, we want your expertise. You are an expert in this sector or this field, and you're going to get this title, and you're going to be given a 10-year period in which you're going to give your expertise to offer advice to the government of the day, look at existing legislation, offer suggestions, amendments. But your idea is you're going to, use your expertise. After 10 years, you can keep your title, as bearing in mind you don't break any laws, but you no longer get to sit in the House of Lords. And I just think that is something that would attract the best and the brightest from around the world, because a peerage is one of the things you can't buy, or you certainly shouldn't be able to buy. Now, I know there'll be people going, well, look at how many Tory donors or Labour donors have ended up in the House of Lords. And I agree. That's why I remove the politicians from it altogether. I think there's far too many people who now enter Westminster. They become a member of the House of Commons as a member of Parliament. They want to become a minister. Then instantly it's like, right, how do I get on the ladder to becoming a peer? How do I remain chummy with the then leader of the day?
Luckily, none of those people have recently joined Reform.
Well, James, I'm sure you're having a swipe there, allegations made against a certain individual, which
I'm
I'm not
not.
going to get into that.
I'm saying I'm sure it's not the case.
Well, I'm sure that we don't see the what was it the former owner of the Evening Standard that ended up in the House of Lords that was a close ally of Boris Johnson
Well,
and had given
another one of your friends.
there's certainly not the I didn't even know this Russian guy who got put in there, but hey ho,
Not him.
um
But
no
so
Boris.
that's okay. I mean, I think who knows where we'll be this week. The interesting thing to me is just how fast. I think by midday tomorrow we could be talking about the same story, but some totally
No,
different angle.
definitely.
But a lot probably now depends on where things go with the police.
And actually,
So
James, just to say, a lot of this is now going to rely on does the Department for Justice in the US cooperate, and how much information will they give the Met Police that maybe has not even yet hit the public realm? So, like you say,
yeah,
we won't know the seriousness of it until the police have been able to potentially access information that currently is still not publicly available? Or are we going to see more Epstein files drop in the public domain before the police have even been able to conclude their investigation, which I'm sure will not be helpful because it does prejudice sometimes an investigation when you've got to make sure a jury of your peers hasn't already got a preconceived idea. But ultimately, it's going to heap more pressure. And will there be more politicians in and around Westminster, past and present, who may be sitting there feeling very nervous about what's going on?
I think so. Um, well, a kind of as we mentioned, a backdrop to that, another one of another problem on Keir Starmer's plate is this Gorton by-election. We
The
did
plate must be massive, James.
it's a it's
Plate.
a big plate. It's like the Alan Partridge one he brings to breakfast, especially large plate.
It's
Uh,
vegetarian plate though, as Keir Starmer is a famous vegetarian.
yes, vegetarian, and so we talked a bit about it last week, but you've been up there today. It's kind
Yep,
of it's starting to shape up. I think since we last spoke, we've got a few candidates now. I think we've got all of the
they're all
main
announced.
candidates.
All
We also, I mean, you reflected this to me. We have what we didn't know is there's a couple of parties we didn't know if they would or wouldn't run, and they're not going to run. So we've seen, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think we've seen your party, the kind of Jeremy Corbyn, Zara Sultana party say they're not going to run. They don't want to split the kind of, I think they would call it the left slash anti-reform vote. And is it George Galloway's party as well? Am I
Workers'
mixed up with
Party for Britain.
Workers' Party for Britain? So we've got two parties, both who would have firmly been on the left, competing with the Greens and Labour for the same pool of votes. Uh,
Yep.
Splitting that vote, make it easier for the right. I think it's fair to say if you look at numbers from the last election, the Tories aren't the Tories are unlikely to have ever won this by-election. So I think that as a bar for them, it's like, I mean, how well they'll do, we'll wait and see. But I think that makes things harder for reform because it solidifies the vote on the other side. But at the same time, if I speak to people in Labour, they're not confident at all of either winning or necessarily the Greens because they think they might take enough from the Greens that you guys can sail through. I don't know. You look
No,
a
it's
lot
interesting,
at
James, what you say
polling,
there.
betting
The
market. I mean,
workers,
it's hard to call.
so the work, so the Workers' Party for Britain dropping out, I think, is a big moment because they do actually have councillors in the Gorton and Denton in the constituency.
Right.
When George Galloway was obviously really making that big push, in fact, obviously, which led him to even being elected as a member of Parliament in that famous by-election
Because
that
given
took place.
he has often made appeals to specific parts of the vote, I think it's worth mentioning. George Galloway has built a lot of his career on appealing to the Muslim vote, and then certainly added to that the kind of pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel. Is that a fair way of describing it?
Yeah,
Uh, Feeling, which is some of the Green vote, and the Gordon and Denton does have a reasonable sized Muslim population, so that's why he's maybe able to get them councillors, and that's why people thought he could pick up votes if they'd have ran a candidate there.
And actually, what's interesting, James, as well is you've even got there with George Galloway himself is actually socially quite conservative. He is what I call an old Labour in a sense of like he actually ran he was very vocal about the need to stop the boats and actually was quite supportive of some of the sort of Rishi Sunak, Nigel Farage positions and views on things. So he has this weird ability to sort of appeal also to what is deemed a white working class sort of red wall kind of voter as well in some cases who are old school Labour, maybe former trade unionists who were big socialists but still had a social conservative element in terms of their
Definitely
outlook.
unfair to pigeonhole him as solely appealing to the Muslim vote.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, obviously that was his bulk of his vote, but I think that there's always that nuance I think that never really got looked at. However, yes, you are correct. So we basically have on the left essentially the Liberal Democrats who have selected a candidate, but I suspect a bit like the Conservatives were never in the race and will barely spend a penny. And I don't attack them on that. If I was in Kemi Badenoch's office, I'd be saying, why throw a load of money at something that ultimately you're never going to be in the race for? We need funds for. There might be other by-elections still to come where we're in the race and we'll want their cash for that. Or obviously we can just fund. We got local elections to fund, so let's focus on the local elections. That's far more important, particularly in councils like Essex, for example, and East and West Surrey have got brand new councils having their first ever elections. The Tories will want to do well there versus the Liberal Democrats, for example. So that leaves you then with Labour and the Greens. On the right, as you say, you've got the Conservatives, but we're putting them by the side. So you've got Reform UK. Now there is, I think, something that's quite interesting. There is Advance UK, and Advance UK was set up by Ben Habib, the former deputy chairman of Reform UK, who had a very public fallout and continues to be very angry and spiteful towards Nigel Farage, and has said that the Reform UK is now the Tory Party 2.0. It's become the establishment. Farage is a fraud, etc., etc. And he has selected a guy called Nick Buckley. Now, what's interesting with Nick Buckley, I'm just checking, it's Nick, not Mick. Yes, it is Nick. There we go. Nick Buckley he's a former police detective from Greater Manchester. He actually ran against Andy Burnham in the last mayoral election in 2024 as an independent and came third. Reformer in fourth place. So again, you know this with mayoral, a bit like Ahmed Yacoub in the West Midlands. Incredible when independents are able to beat, parties like that. So the fear is that Nick Buckley has got a profile in Greater Manchester, is known to voters, and has obviously demonstrated that he can put on a sizable amount of votes without even being part of a political organisation even if Advance UK take 5 to 10% in an election that I believe is going to be Runcorn style tight, Runcorn won by 6 votes. That is the difference between winning and losing. Now, there's been no obvious signs yet that Advance UK are out campaigning or delivering leaflets or directing mail, but Ben Habib has got deep pockets. He has got money. If he wants to spend it, he will be able to. There has been friction I've seen from the online writers, I would refer to them. Some saying it's outrageous that that Advance UK have put forward a candidate. At the end of the day, whatever differences Ben and Nigel might have, it's better to have someone on the centre right rather than rather than Keir Starmer winning, etc., etc. Others going, well, reform should have stuck to its principles. It should have been more purist and ideological. So that's an element that'll be interesting. I say that because there was a by-election. We saw it, James, in Amber Valley, where Advance UK got 12% of the vote ahead of the Conservative Party. That's an eye-opening moment in a red wall area. So again, let's see what happens there. I think that will come down. I think Advance UK's brand awareness is still is barely exists. So I think that will count against them. But you never know in this digital world what damage can happen. But you are correct in saying this. There is a feeling from people I've spoken to in Labour who say, look, we know it's very hard for us to win this, but we're in a very tricky situation. We can't afford to look like we've lost it easily, because if we have, that weakens Keir Starmer and makes him vulnerable to a challenge. We we might have been prepared to come second, like Runcorn, in a tight election. We cannot afford to come third. Because if we come third and Reform win, that's bad news for us because the Greens are still beating us. But I think you and I both agree, James, the worst case scenario, which is Reform winning is still very bad, but the worst case scenario is Labour third, Reform second, and Greens first. Because if the Green Party can demonstrate to the soft Labour left, we can go in to Labour heartlands and we can, one, stop reform. Two, we can beat Labour, and therefore three, voting Green isn't a wasted vote. And the idea of vote Green, get reform as a tactic by Labour will be thrown out the window and give Zach Polansky the ability to say the polling, the momentum, the membership that's been joining in its droves in the Greens from the left of British politics isn't just a flash in the pan, it's a real thing. And will put huge pressure on the likes of Your Party to say, is it not time for you to formally just accept the Green Party is now the socialist alternative to the Labour Party, and let's not have all these other parties on the left. Let's just coalesce around me. And Zach Polansky's already publicly said, Corbyn, Sultana, I would welcome you into the Green Party if you want to.
And you would have to say, so on that, I'd say my observation would be one, I question how confident the Greens really are, because I think if they were really confident, I think Polanski runs and becomes an MP. So you tell me what you think of that. Second thing, I think the chances of the left organizing themselves and not being in various factions, I would say, is slim to none.
It's like the five families from the last Conservative Party.
Yeah, exactly. Where they even are, where there's arguments in the five families before they even arrive at the meeting. I mean, with the left, the families are having an argument themselves before they even arrive at a meeting of the other four families. So I think, I think that's unlikely in the long term. Interesting that they've done it now for this by-election, though. I think if you were, to your point, like, what do we use these things for? We use these by-elections, the by-elections of an MP. One of the things that's gonna that I think that reform will say to voters is, look, you might not be convinced about Shiat running the government, but you don't need to be. It's one MP. It's not going to change things. Send a message to Keir Starmer. Do you think he's doing a good job? I think we can both answer that question on behalf of a huge amount of the electorate. And if, by the way,
The YouGov approval ratings. I think
yeah,
answer that question.
look, if it comes down to that, reform win by, forget your 6 votes, right? If they just measured on that, they were going to clean up. But
And just
Greens
to back you up there, James, that is the message. Matt Goodwin, Reform UK's candidate, is saying very clearly this is a referendum on Keir Starmer, and making it about vote reform, get Starmer out is very much the tagline that's being pushed.
That seems the right way to go to me. I think and they'll kind of push that, but the Greens can push that as well. That's the thing, and I think the Greens will want to run a kind of stop for. I do. My sense is that's a bit harder because can you really sell? Or can you really sell that? As in, what's it really going to do? It's not going to make Farage much more powerful to have one more MP. It's going to give them momentum, but it's I don't know if I was just a normal person at home, I was like, yeah, I'm not just going to go and vote for that because I know he's not going to be prime minister. So what do we look at these things for? By-elections and local elections are important. They run your local. They're more important than perhaps people give them credit for. But we observers look at them for signs of what's going to happen in the general election over the next couple of years. What does it mean? Where are voters at politically? So I think it's interesting that they've stood down now. That's something. It's not nothing. We can say that, right?
And you've been open, James, about the fact that this will lean into the fact that this is first time we've seen the deal. We know that deals go on behind the scenes. This is a very open public. We are making a decision and asking people to lend a vote, and leans into a point you've been making where you and I think looked into this, and we've seen that it's expected on average people tactically vote 3 in 10 voters. Tactically vote to try and
Yeah.
stop another party. A lot of people are saying it's going to be higher than that. So this is now a moment ago. We've had parties officially stand down. So now let's see what happens. Does that tactical voting dramatically increase? Caerphilly, where Reform lost by a much larger margin than expected to Plaid, suggested it is happening in larger numbers, because obviously that did come at the expense of Labour, who went all the way down to 10, 11%, which was utterly shocking. However, that was in Wales, where there was a very clear alternative. The problem with this by-election, a friend of ours said, who used to work inside Labour HQ, which I thought was fascinating, is voters may get confused because the Labour Party has to attack this seat as aggressively, saying we're the ones that can stop reform as the Greens. And does that therefore cause confusion for voters about which one actually is best positioned to stop reform? And because of that confusion, reform therefore slips through the middle.
Yeah. I have to say, I think It might change as the days go on. I think early doors, I thought, are Reform really going to do this? I think if you look at the numbers, it's going to be really close, and so they've got a chance. The more I think about it the past few days, the more I think, and look, other people said this straight away, that I think without Burnham, I think that Labour Green vote splits, and I think I think Reform have a good chance. I think Reform's shown they've got confidence putting forward a high profile candidate. I think the Greens have shown they're not quite sure by not having Polanski. To me, um, Labour, they just got bogged down in internal politics. The thing I think we'll end on, and hopefully we're going to have a pollster on in the next 3 or 4 weeks. I think we'll have them on. That I think we should talk more. Maybe have the focus of that episode actually is what you just alluded to is tactical voting. And I was talking to someone about it today in terms of the next general election and whether Reform can win and whether Reform can win an outright majority, and the problem of having the Tories still around kind of 18-19%, or even if they're going to 20 or is this, are we seeing and looking at this election for signs of things to come? So the next election, at the moment, it's shaping up as if no one will be like Labour in 24, very clearly going to have a majority. The debate at the end of the kind of 24 general election campaign was don't give Labour too big a majority. People gave it to them. Turns out they still managed to screw it up anyway, but that's their problem. I wonder if when we go into the next election, it'll be a race for the Prime Minister, because that's what general elections ultimately are. Will it be Nigel Farage? Will it be Keir Starmer? Or whoever's leader of Labour Party? Can Kevin McBallin do it? Etc. But I wonder if the bit underneath that, which will be quite public, will be about tactical voting. Will be who's best to stop the person I don't like. Who's best to be in coalition with them to make sure the things I want to happen. Oh, I'm not quite comfortable with Reform. Maybe I will vote Tory because I feel a bit safer having them around because they've done government before. Maybe. Or I'm a Tory, but I want to see something a bit more revolutionary. Maybe I'll throw Farage into the mix. Or, I'm on the left, but I'm too scared of Farage. I'm therefore going to vote for a party I don't always vote for that I don't particularly like. I, I wonder if the whole process, maybe it won't get too complicated, but I wonder if, because we've seen more and more tactical voting, I wonder if we're really going to start getting into that, because you've alluded to that's a lot of the debate around this, certainly on the left in this particular by-election, is very much how does that tactical voting, how can someone who wants to vote on the left of British politics get the person they want to win? It's not clear in this one. If you just if a lot, there might be a lot of people that have said, look, if you tell us it's Labour, we'll vote Labour. If you tell us it's Greens, we'll vote Greens. No one can tell them. So they, what, and that might well be part of the next general election.
No, look, I think it is fascinating because I think if we see a rerun of Caerphilly and Greens or Labour win the seat and therefore stop Reform, who you would expect, and I think for Reform it's important at the very least they come second and a good second at that, because if there's a decent swing, they can say, well, if you apply that swing to across England, for example, then we would pick up 150, 200 seats. So I don't think second place is bad for Reform. I think first place would be a political earthquake for Reform or the Greens, to be quite frank. I think Keir Starmer would be in peril if he comes third and Reform and the Greens, one of those two is first and the other one second. But if we see a rerun of Caerphilly, if we see the Greens win or Labour win by quite a decent margin, because it's clear one left vote cohort decided to fully fly in behind another, I think only then will ramp up and we can ask, hopefully, our guest how much pressure will be applied, probably via donors, to be quite frank, to have Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage get in a room and discuss deals. Now, you know my position. I don't think there should be a deal. I don't think the Conservative Party can be trusted to honour a deal, personally. But I also accept that there will be people, there already are people, Jacob Rees-Mogg, for example, within the
Maybe we'll
Conservative
be more
Party.
trustworthy now we've got rid of the people who weren't trustworthy in the last government, and we're giving it to
Oh,
you.
okay. Oh, James, dear, oh dear.
You,
Believe me, I know those characters on the back
you went
benches.
there.
I
You went
know
there.
those characters on the back benches. But what I will say
Well,
is that,
you know a lot of the characters who were in our last government because they're now with you in reform. But
oh, I
we
know
can do
plenty
that
of
on
the
another
Conservative
episode.
Party. Well, we have that. We'll keep doing that. But you are right. What pressure does that apply? And I think that's the bit I'm fascinated to see is what the outcome is. Did the left wing vote fail to coalesce around one party? And therefore, will that be the thing that is a learning lesson that's used? Or did the left vote manage to coalesce? Or is actually the message of get Starmer out super powerful? Is it that in red wall areas, a bit gone to the Denton in particular, is very red wall, white working class, quite big disadvantage economically and socially prevalent in that area as well. You know, it's very much the reform voter there. You know, for example, if people are in their droves in those type of red wall areas going to reform, then does that say that Labour's red walls is already gone, which actually then harms Morgan McSweeney, who's very much been pivoting into that's the voter we need to keep, and therefore does that end up with Tim Allen, who'd be much more like let's talk about the customs union, let's talk about with the European Union, let's talk about more progressive style politics. Does that then lead to a pivot in the type of voter that Labour MPs, who would probably be happier to pivot into in terms of who they target? It's going to be a fascinating election. I think it's going to have huge ramifications for Greens, Reform, and Labour in good or bad, depending on what the outcomes are. And I think it will be the basis of a lot of conversation leading into the local elections. Which again, if Keir Starmer comes third, it is not the type of if Reform or Greens win, it's not the framing you want leading into, particularly those devolved elections in Wales and Scotland, where we've seen now one poll in Wales, James, I think you and I are scratching our head, says that Pride wins very comfortably, Reform second and actually underperforms.
We've got
And,
the
and
kind of
another
difference on
poll,
the polls.
and then another poll that says Reform's actually currently in the lead and it's kind of neck and neck with Pride in terms of seats. But in Scotland, that YouGov poll that really shocked me, I think it's YouGov's first dip in the water when it came to Scotland. They're suggesting Reform UK will walk away with 22 seats and Labour on 15. So a clear second place win for Reform UK and Labour in third. I mean, if you end up with Labour third in Gores and Denton, Labour third in Wales, and we expect that to happen by quite a way, I think, let's be frank, and Labour third in Scotland, you've got to think Keir Starmer's going to be, well, he is then fighting for his life even more than he is doing now.
Well, he is, and I think on that we will leave people to the little piece of heaven and stability that is Keir Starmer's Britain. I mean, I don't know if you can hear it. Can you hear the quiet?
It's lovely, isn't it?
It's lovely. Well, we'll
It's
leave it
lovely.
there.
Well, James, thank you so much again. As always, listeners, you know what to do. Make sure you hit that subscribe and follow button, however it is you listen to your podcast, to make sure you stay up to date. We are on YouTube, we are on Substack, we are on other platforms too. So please make sure that you are staying connected and listen out for our following episodes. It is a good night from me, and it's a good night from him, and we'll see you soon.
Good night.